biggest update is I wanted to talk about our plan for regathering. After a lot of prayer, a lot of discernment, a lot of talking to other pastors, looking at other churches, praying with our advisory team, our parish council, we've decided that we will begin regathering for in-person worship in a limited capacity on Sunday, February 7th. And of course, we're going to start small, lower numbers, and then gradually, as we get our feet wet and figure it out, we will increase that cap. But that's our plan, February 7th. And there's a rationale behind this that I think it's really important for me to share, because I know that there are a lot of strong feelings about this on both sides in our congregation, and really in congregations all around the country. We have a wide range of perspectives in our congregation, and you sort of have two ends of the spectrum. And really what I've realized as a pastor is that there are two distinct and seemingly opposed moral frameworks that people are operating out of in our church. Some of you are sort of neutral and you don't care one way or another, but there are many people who are operating out of these distinct moral frameworks. And what's important to understand is both of these frameworks have as their aim to love our neighbor. All right, so both are ways that people believe we should be loving our neighbor. On one side of the spectrum, you have people who believe that the best way to love our neighbor is to do everything that we can to keep the infection rate as low as possible. So that means that while we might prefer to meet in person, while that might be something that we would personally prefer, we are willing to sacrifice that for the sake of loving our neighbor by doing all that we can to minimize the risk of transmission of COVID. That's one argument, and I think it's biblical. I think it's justifiable. That's in fact the argument that we have been following since March. But there's another way of seeing this on the other end of the spectrum. There are those who believe that the best way that we can love our neighbor is to prioritize meeting in person for worship, the argument being the same that you might hear in the warning message before you take off on an airplane flight, that we need to be able to secure our own mask before we attend to the needs of the people around us. And the longer we go without meeting, the more and more and more dire our situation becomes spiritually. We are actually less equipped to love our neighbors because we don't have an adequate worshiping life ourselves. And so worshiping is, according to this view, essential for our spiritual health. It needs to be among our highest priorities, right? And so what I want you to hear me say as your pastor is this. I think that both are legitimate, both are biblical ways of thinking about what is a very challenging decision to have to make as a church. We stopped meeting in March based on that first ethic. We've had services online. We've done everything that we can to flatten the curve, and I firmly believe that that was the right decision. So while we've been legally allowed to meet for some time now, our rationale up to this point has been the best way to love our neighbors is to flatten the curve and reduce the spread of COVID-19. Some might ask, okay, well, if that's what we've been doing since March, what changed? Why would we change now? Especially when the numbers are so high. Why in the world would we consider a change in course now? And there are a few things that have changed with regard to COVID. We know a lot more than we did back in March and April. We understand much more about how it spreads and the people who are at highest risk. We've made great advances with regard to treating, and the vaccines are being rolled out right now, and there are some people in our congregation who have already received the vaccine, more people who are scheduled to receive the vaccine. So even though the numbers are high, we can see the light at the end of the tunnel in some ways. We're also in close communication with a number of churches, congregations right around us who are already meeting again in person. And so we have examples that we can follow of how to do it safely. But I want to make it clear that there's more at stake here. It's more than just a kind of logistical decision. As a church with a sacramental theology, we believe that gathering for in-person worship is not just a preference. We believe that it's actually essential to the Christian life. It's a top priority for the spiritual well-being of our church. And this aligns with our core regathering principles that we laid out at the beginning of this pandemic. The word ecclesia, which we translate church, means a physical gathering of people in one place to worship the Lord. And it it centralizes the idea that we are embodied beings, we are embodied creatures, and ultimately we need embodied worship to be the body of Christ. So meeting virtually works for a time. We've been able to do this, I think, thanks to the creativity and flexibility of our team. We've been able to do this fairly well for the past 9 or so months, but it can never permanently replace in-person worship. It can never take the place of being the ecclesia together in one place. And what we see is that the costs of not meeting in person are cumulative. They're cumulative over time. So some of you are healthcare professionals and you are trained to look for signs of physical illness. You focus on the health and well-being of the body. If I may be so bold, in many ways, my focus is on the health and well-being of the soul. And I'm trained to look for signs of spiritual illness, spiritual sickness. And that's what we as pastors do. That's our one of our jobs as shepherds in the church. And so as we look, we have anecdotal evidence and observational evidence that would suggest that our congregation has suffered somewhat from not meeting for so long. Anecdotally, there are many people who have reported to me that they feel spiritually drained, spiritually disconnected from the church, disconnected from their faith, disconnected from God, disconnected from God's people. There are more and more people who have elected to leave our church to go to other churches that are already meeting in person. As I said, there are a number in our area that are doing that. And then there's also observational evidence. I can't draw a one-to-one causal relationship here, but I've witnessed what I believe are signs of spiritual erosion. I believe that our people right now are being formed primarily by social media, primarily by what is happening online. And I think that the effects have been corrosive. I see people who seem to be driven more and more now by fear and anxiety, as well as anger and outrage. I see longtime friendships that are breaking down. I see a heightened spirit of criticism, and I also see a heightened sense of moralism and even self-righteousness, especially when it comes to politics in our own community. And wherever the gospel is receding, what you see taking its place is most often moralism and self-righteousness. And I don't mean this as a critique. I mean this as an assessment of our collective spiritual health. I'm talking about myself. I'm including all of us in what I'm saying. And so as pastors, we have to weigh spiritual risks alongside physical risks. And that's what's really driving this decision. So the bottom line is that we are currently, unless this changes, we are legally allowed to meet in person for worship in a limited capacity. There are a number of people, a growing number of people who have come to me desperate for us to regather, to provide an opportunity for in-person worship for them. And as I look around and see other churches doing it, it is harder and harder for me to give a good reason why we wouldn't provide that option for the people who want it. We want to do our best to recognize and serve and come alongside people who want to worship in person, as well as those who are not comfortable to do it. We want to provide both options, and we will do so as long as we need to, indefinitely. More than likely, as long as technology allows, we will continue indefinitely doing both. And so what I want to ask from you is, I want to ask for charity. One of the marks of the Christian life, a spirit of charity toward those with whom you might disagree. There are people in our church who think that we should not meet in person anytime soon. I respect you. I respect the reasons why you would think that. I would ask that regardless of how you feel personally, recognize that there are people who are desperate to meet in person. Online is not working for them. It's not working for their kids. So just respect that as a valid need. For those who do choose to gather in person, I ask that you recognize the validity of the people who are not comfortable doing so. It doesn't mean they're cowards. It doesn't mean that they're faithless. It doesn't mean that they're political. It doesn't mean that they're hiding in their bunkers or any of the other rhetoric. I want to encourage you to think of the fact that there's a very real risk of infection right now. The numbers are very high, and the last thing that we want is some kind of super spreader event connected to our church. And these are very real, legitimate concerns. I would ask that for those of you who want to meet in person, that you would commit to loving your community well by recognizing that the choices that you make from Monday to Saturday will put the congregation at risk on Sunday when you come for worship. So I would ask that if you're a person who wants to come for in-person worship, that you would think about the choices that you're making and the exposure that you're taking on in your life, that you would think about that through the lens of the people that you're worshiping with on Sunday, and that you would even consider prioritizing church over other exposure activities, that you might choose to sacrifice and live with a greater level of restraint in the other areas of your life so that you can come and be a part of our church in person safely. We're going to be rolling all of this out slowly. We're going to be sending out a lot more information so that the goal is that you would be over-informed at every step of the way. We're going to choose to restrict ourselves, at least initially, far beyond what the requirements would stipulate, because we do want to demonstrate our commitment to loving our neighbor. And so we're going to specifically limit the number of people who can attend initially well below our maximum capacity that would be allowed under the current regulations. We're also going to do things like initially prohibiting singing and implementing additional strategies during this time. I want to make clear as my last point that we see a major difference between recklessness and a calculated risk. And as we look around and realize that there is no risk-free solution, there's no risk-free choice, that this is a choice about which calculated risks we are willing to take and what is our appetite for risk. So this is a reflection of that.